So I think that the best way to introduce this is to say that I got interested in this topic when I was following in particular the controversy in the British Labour Party about anti-Semitism, in which claims of anti-Semitism were used to drive a great many people out of the Labour Party. And what began to become apparent about this was that disproportionately, the people who were being driven out of the Labour Party for being anti-Semites were in fact Jewish, which is a little bit odd. And I started looking at this, and it became clear that it was part of a much wider trend. And this is a trend in which anti-Semitism, which of course traditionally has meant racism directed at Jews, no longer means that. The claim of anti-Semitism is repeatedly directed at people, many of whom, as I say, are Jewish, not because they hate Jews, not because they despise Jews, but because they are either critics of or opponents of the Israeli state. So anti-Semitism, first instance, there's more to it than this. Anti-Semitism, which once meant hatred of Jews, now means opposition or criticism of a particular state and of a particular political project. And more than a few of those people who are critical of that particular state and that particular political project happen to be Jewish. And therefore, they are tarred with the anti-Semitic brush. So that was one anomaly which was interesting. The second anomaly, which was equally interesting and which ties up into that, is that while Jews were being labeled with the smear that they were anti-Semitic, people who were genuinely anti-Semitic or anti-Semitic in the way in which we would understand that traditionally, in other words, people who thoroughly disliked Jews, were firm and enthusiastic allies of the Israeli state, engaged very often in a mutual admiration exercise with that state. So that I'm thinking here of Donald Trump, who, when he campaigned the first time around, pictured his opponent, Hillary Clinton, with Jewish stars of David, surrounded by Jewish stars of David, bringing in money, etc., very standard and old anti-Semitic slur, who at the same time was a very loud and vocal and uncompromising supporter of the Israeli state. Jair Bolsonaro, former president of Brazil, who claimed that Jews in the death camps had died of cold and starvation and that nobody had actually been trying to kill them. Viktor Orban in Hungary, who was a fan of Miklos Horthy, who was an openly Nazi. All of these people who seem to thoroughly dislike Jews were great fans of the Israeli state. So what I wanted to do, and what the book tries to do, is explain these two seeming oddities. And the explanations are very closely linked. The first explanation has nothing in particular to do with Jews or anti-Semitism. The first explanation is that this tendency to smear critics of a political project as racist was actually part of a much wider trend in the Anglo-Saxon world or in the Western European world, which had been going on for some time. The defining feature, the common thread between all those people being accused of anti-Semitism in this particular way, is that all of those people are anti-racist, or they campaign on anti-racist platforms. So we have this rather bizarre situation where it's the anti-racists who are accused of racism. And this is not peculiar to anti-Semitism, it's not peculiar to Jews, because, and I trace this back to the 1970s, round about the 1970s, which obviously is half a century ago, in some cases in the United States, but it's now at a much wider application around the world, racists began to change their strategy. Previously, of course, and there is a chapter in the book on racism and anti-Semitism and what it really is, previously people who harbored those prejudices and that bigotry were very open about despising Jews and other groups because they were considered inferior or they were considered immoral, or whatever the case may be. From the 1970s, the tactics started to change, and the people who wanted racial change began to be accused of being the racists. And this began in the United States when white men began taking people to court, universities to court specifically, because they'd been refused admission on the grounds that they were discriminated against because they were white, that Black people were given posts because they were Black, and therefore they were the victims of racial discrimination. And this is a trend which continues to this day. If you look around the European world, and European is not only continental Europe, it's also places where Europeans have settled, the US, Canada, Australia, South Africa, white South Africa, that this is a recurrent theme, that if you are anti-racist, if you're a critic of racism, you get repeatedly accused of being a racist yourself. So it's part of an international trend. But the more interesting aspect, perhaps, is how this plays itself specifically out when we talk about Jews and anti-Semitism. And one of the ways, in order to trace that, we need to go back some years in which writing started to appear in the United States about something called the new anti-Semitism. And a variety of authors were writing about new anti-Semitism, many of them attached to mainstream Jewish organizations, part of the Jewish establishment. And essentially, if one looked at the writing on the new anti-Semitism, on one level, it just appeared to be deranged, in the sense that among the targets, among things which were accused of being anti-Semitic or positions which were accused of being anti-Semitic, was opposition to the Electoral College in the United States, opposition to nuclear power, and in one classic formulation from one of these authors, anti-Semites are people who demonize peace, demonize war and exalt peace. And you look at this and you say, well, what on earth is going on here? Nothing has got to do with hatred of Jews at all. And the thread becomes very clear. All of this has to do with hatred of the Israeli state, hatred in inverted commas. Go back to what I said earlier, opposition or criticism. So what has happened there is that the state has become, in effect, the Jews. And Jews who do not identify with the state are demonized themselves. Now, so the reason why opposition to the Electoral College, nuclear powers, etc., is considered anti-Semitic is that, rightly or wrongly, in most cases wrongly, but that's a side issue, that this is considered to be hostile to the interests of the Israeli state. And if you do a bit of digging on this, it turns out that this is not just a bunch of people in the US with an axe to grind. This actually comes out of discussions within the Israeli state itself. Because fairly on in the history of the Israeli state, it became part of the armory, the propaganda armory, to denounce anybody who opposed the state as an anti-Semite, including, of course, all Palestinians. So the new anti-Semitism was not the invention of a few Americans. It was a considered strategy by the Israeli state to portray opponents as anti-Semitic. When you do a bit more digging, it becomes even more interesting, because what I try to do in the book is to trace this not to an immediate strategy, but to what is Zionism, which is the ideology which underpins the Israeli state. And essentially, relying on some very important work from some academics who I think have important things to say about this issue, I argue that Zionism has been misrepresented. It's been represented repeatedly as the liberation movement of the Jewish people. I've seen it referred to numerous times, the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. And the impression is created that Zionists are people who feel very strongly about, they're very proud of being Jewish, and who believe that they need a state in order to show how deeply Jewish they are and to enable them to be authentically Jewish. And of course, that weaponizes itself in the allegation against people who do not support the state, who happen to be Jewish, that they are so-called self-hating Jews. Self-hating in the sense that they dislike the fact that they happen to have been born Jewish. But if you actually go back to the origins of Zionism, quite the opposite is the case. Zionists are not trying to become proud Jews. They're trying to become Western Europeans. And many of the early Zionists were as nasty about Jews as anti-Semites are. Many of the early Zionists spoke of Jews in the same disparaging terms as anti-Semites did, as the Jewish racists did. And in fact, Theodor Herzl, who is usually credited with being the founder of the Zionist movement, Herzl, in a famous exchange, agreed with a notorious anti-Semite that Jews were as grubby and offensive and unpleasant as the anti-Semites said then. But, said Herzl, the only reason Jews are like this is because they don't have a state. And if Jews have a state, then they will be nice Western Europeans like everyone else. And it's telling that Herzl writes a novel called Alt Neuland, Old New Land, in which he spells out in fictionalized form the state and how it should look. And what is the state all about? It's filled with people who every evening get dressed up in top hat and tails, and they go to the opera. And among the languages which are official languages of the state is German. And, adds Herzl, the Jewish state will encourage dueling because dueling adds French refinement to society. So none of this is about being proudly Jewish at all. It's all really about being very embarrassed about being Jewish. And if you look at Sigmund Freud, who wasn't active in the Zionist movement, but was a very enthusiastic Zionist, you see exactly the same thing. Freud writes a book called Moses and Monotheism, in which he lionizes the biblical figure Moses because he believes he's an anti-Semite. Because he says Moses was really an Egyptian who really didn't like the Jews and told them off all the time, and therefore he was a great man. So what we're really dealing with here is a desire not to become authentically Jewish, but to become Western. And in the process of becoming Western, it becomes necessary to demonize and denigrate everything which was traditionally Jewish. Now, it's very important for me to stress here because it's open to very valid misunderstanding. When I say that they turned their back on everything which was authentically Jewish, I do not for a moment mean, and I point this out several times in the book, I do not for a moment mean that the only real Jews are religious people who study the Talmud in seminaries and obey the religious laws. There have always been, for as long as it was possible, different ways of Jewish self-expression. So traditionally, some Jews were people who did that. Other Jews were people who joined the labor movement, who became secular left-wingers. Other Jews were people who lived a particular lifestyle as peddlers and people involved in small trade, etc. There were all sorts of varieties of Jewish expression, etc. But all of these are in effect vilified and demonized by Zionist thinkers as an indication of a group of people who are really not fit to be white Westerners. And the entire Zionist project then becomes a process of trying to become white Westerners. And it's reciprocated because Jews, up until the Nazi genocide, had been in Europe, but not really of Europe. They'd been in Europe, but very often treated as outsiders. And the Nazi genocide shocked large sections of Europe into recognizing where that kind of attitude could lead. And it had the added bonus of the fact that the state of Israel was a Western enclave in the Middle East. And sadly, for me, there's a brilliant book which has just come out on Germany after World War II, which obviously was not available when I wrote my book. And one of the many striking things about this book is that Konrad Adenauer, who was the first chancellor of Germany after World War II, and who's very revered in traditional Jewish circles, etc., when he pledged his friendship to the Israeli state, he said, I'm slightly paraphrasing, but in effect he said, you are the West's representatives in the Middle East, and we have a duty to protect you. And that, in a sense, sums up why you have this blanket Western support for the Israeli state, because on the one hand, there is a justifiable guilt complex for decades of anti-Jewish racism, but it plays itself out in a very colonial way. And it plays itself out in a colonial way, which not only says Jews are entitled to respect because they are human beings who should not have been discriminated against, but more importantly, that Jews are entitled to respect because they are Westerners like us. And that explains Bolsonaro and Trump and Orban, because as far as they are concerned, they don't much like Jews. But the Israeli state isn't run by Jews anymore. It's run by Israelis. And Israelis are white Westerners like us. They're not grubby Jews like the people their parents and grandparents had to deal. And therefore, what we see today, these seeming anomalies in which Jews are driven out of the Labour Party for being anti-Semitic, and anti-Semites arrive at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in the Israeli state to pay respect to people they deeply despise, are explained by the fact that, in fact, what we're dealing with here is not a Jewish liberation movement, but in fact another example of the European desire to keep white Westernness going. The question of whether Jews are a religious group, ethnic group, etc., is a complicated question, and the answer is bits of the above, etc., etc. But I think the reference to Islamophobia is, there are 2 points to be made here. The first one is that despite the sort of polite references to Islamophobia, etc., the tolerance for Islamophobia is quite high in the West. Okay, and
yes,
the anti-Semitism is fake, but it's far more vigorous than the anti-Islamophobic. But what I find interesting about this, and several scholars have made this point, is that there's a sense in which in the mainstream Western imagination, Muslims have become what Jews were 100 years ago. Okay, they're the outsider who's in Europe, who really doesn't belong here, who has all sorts of unpleasant customs and really isn't civilized like us. And what has happened, therefore, is that Jews, or those Jews, not all Jews, Jews who are anti-Zionist are still pariahs in Europe. I mean, you have this bizarre situation which people have drawn attention to in Germany, where the grandchildren of Nazis are lecturing Jews on how they must react to racism and bigotry, which borders on the psychotic, So because Jews who are good Jews, which is the title of the book, good Jews who are pro-Zionist are now card-carrying Westerners. Muslims are not card-carrying Westerners, not unless they cease to be Muslim, at various writers, etc.
Yes.
So in a sense, it's linked in the Western mind in the sense that, as I say, in that particular prejudiced imagination, Muslimness has taken the place of Jewishness. Thanks. It's an interesting question. I mean, it fits into the lens in the sense that, and I'll talk about this when I talk about women and feminism, etc. It's one of the ways in which Western prejudice expresses itself now is precisely in those terms. We are modern, they are pre-modern, they are primitive. And you see it all over the place, not only in journalism, it's in academic writing, etc. The idea that white Westerners are modern people and others are pre-modern people. And that is very crucial. Yeah, you're quite correct. That's absolutely crucial to this thing. So in a sense, the good Jews who are the pro-Israeli Jews are the modern people. And the bad Jews are stuck in the past and are pre-modern people who believe in all sorts of pre-modern things like justice and so forth. So yeah, it is quite an important part of the way in which particular views get stigmatized. Yes. It was a comment rather than a question, which I agree with. I mean, I think it was fundamentally a westernizing project, and there is, for those of you who understand Hebrew, but I'll translate it for those of you who don't. There's a phrase called shlilat hagola, which actually means negation of the diaspora. And negation of the diaspora, which is a very strong part of the Zionist ideology, it doesn't mean that people who live outside the state or who are not actively assisting the state are people with a different opinion, etc. They're actually come pretty close to being non-Jews. They must be negated, they must be destroyed. So there's no sense. I mean, it's quite ironic if you go back to some of the earliest, I mean, it was always a colonial way of thinking, but if you go back to, Chada Am was one of the early Zionists. I mean, he thought it was ridiculous to believe that all Jews would be, would play a role in some kind of Jewish state. But along the way, it became an ideological tool to say, look, if you are not, if you are not either in the state or actively working the state, you are a non-being in a sense. Negation is a very strong word, and I think from the very beginning, the idea that this was simply a way of thinking which people might agree or disagree with was not part of the Zionist package, if I can put it that way. Within a strict definition of settler colonialism, it's quite clearly a settler colonial state. I mean, settler colonialism is an arrangement in which people from Europe arrive in a place which is not Europe and colonize it by settling. I mean, from the beginning, if you look at somebody like, if you look at, once again, at Chada Am and the early pioneers, etc., they used the term colonization repeatedly. It was a positive as far as they were concerned. It wasn't a pejorative word. They would say, we're trying to colonize this land. So in that sense, I don't think that there's any doubt about that. But what I try to show in the book is that it's not just a physical presence it's a way of thinking, which, as I keep on stressing, is a way of thinking which is about Europeanness, which is about Westernness, etc. Which is proving immensely stubborn, despite the fact that we are supposedly living in a post-colonial era. And in the last two chapters, I talk at some length about the way in which this plays itself out in South Africa and the way in which it plays itself out in various other parts of the world. And one of the important takeaways from this, which goes well beyond the question of anti-Semitism, is that most of my academic work over the last while or so has been on democracy. And I've become increasingly convinced that when the Western mainstream talks about democracy, it doesn't mean what I think democracy is, which is people choosing and making their own decisions and people being free. It means Western. So that you describe Israel, the Israeli state, as the only democracy in the Middle East. And it's not a democracy because, we could, if anybody wants me to quote chapter and verse about why it's not a democracy, I'd be happy to do that. But clearly a state, which has been, ruling over, large numbers of people without really giving them any say, is not democratic. So what do they mean when they say it's the only democracy in the Middle East? They mean it's the only Western state in the Middle East, and it's deeply colonial. And of course, even the way in which the support for the Israeli state in Europe plays itself out illustrates this point. Because I made this point about the Germans earlier on. I mean, increasingly having looked at this new book, etc. The German historical support for the Israeli state is actually an expression of a very deep colonial racism, which, among other things, says in effect, white Germans murdered 6 million Jews, and Palestinians must pay the price for this for the rest of eternity. I can't think of anything much more colonial than that. Let's turn now to the question of Zionism and anti-Semitism. Well, in the first case, as I pointed out earlier on, I mean, if you are appalled, as the Zionists were, if you are appalled by the way in which Jews have lived their lives for the last umpteen years, 20, 30 centuries, if you find religious Jews offensive, if you find secular Jews offensive, if you find Jewish tradespeople offensive, then you're an anti-Semite, for heaven's sake. There isn't, if you go back to Houston Stuart Chamberlain, who was Wavella Amar and these guys who I talk about in the book, who were the original anti-Semites, they don't, some of the things they say about Jews are very much the same as some of the things the early Zionists said about Jews. But there's also, of course, another aspect in which Zionism is added. Sorry, just to illustrate that point, I should have mentioned that. I mean, I do discuss in the book the ideas of a man called Daniel Boyarin, who is a professor of Talmudic studies and very interesting Jewish theorist in the United States. And Boyarin argues that, in fact, the Zionists were the self-hating Jews. Precisely for the reasons I've given, because they found being Jewish embarrassing, and they thought that if they had a state, then it would cease to be embarrassing because they'd be like all the other white Western folks. But the other way in which Zionism is anti-Semitic is that it associates Jews with atrocities, to be quite blunt. It says that if you do not agree with hounding 1.2 million people out of their homes in Gaza and bombing hospitals and schools and United Nations centers, if you do not agree with that, then you are not Jewish. That's profoundly anti-Semitic. I mean, one of the many anti-Semitic slanders which have been directed at Jews is that they have dual loyalties. They pretend to be loyal to the country in which they live, but they really, loyal. Well, before 1948, they're loyal to some Jewish authority, and now they're loyal to the Israeli state. And Zionism plays into that. So, there is something deeply anti-Semitic about the slogan which says anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, because what the slogan says is that if you don't support violence, if you don't support racism, you're not Jewish. I would imagine that most white people would find it repulsive to be told that, if they don't support racism, they're not really white. So in that sense, yeah, it's deeply anti-Semitic. And, there was a very interesting article. I mean, it creates anti-Semitism in the sense that it links an entire people with the actions of a few. And there was a very interesting article a while back in an online publication called Mondovice, which is an American sort of Jewish anti-Zionist publication, in which a Palestinian who, this was before October the 7th, who was deprived of his home by the Israeli state who gave it to settlers, makes the point that, he's almost told to be anti-Semitic because he's told that these people are entitled to things because they're Jewish. And these articles actually entitled, "People Stole My Home, It's Not My Fault They Were Jewish." And the point that he's trying to make is that he's not the one who's drawing attention to their Jewishness. It's the state and its ideology which is drawing attention to this. So, yeah, I think, if you take the original definition of anti-Semitism, then the state is a far more obvious source of anti-Semitism than its opponents. Okay, well, the second one's easy and straightforward. Yes, it is a Whiteness Project. That's precisely what I say in the book, that they wanted to be white Europeans. That is whiteness. That's why white supremacists. I don't know. I mean, I'm open. I don't know of white supremacists who dislike or criticize the Israeli state. A support for the Israeli state is a sort of non-negotiable among white supremacists. And you have to ask yourself why, because it's a pretty obvious example of the Whiteness Project, absolutely. As far as its relationship, look, it's unusual. There are aspects to this which, don't exist in other colonial ideologies. Okay, I mean, the British never said that that there was a holy book which says that they actually came from Africa. It is based on an ironic claim, ironic in the sense that it's based on a religious text, but the people who make the claim don't believe in the religious text. This wonderful quote from Ilan Pappé summarizing that attitude. Zionists believe God doesn't exist, but he gave us the land. They don't believe in the Jewish religion, but they quote Jewish religious texts. And that doesn't, as I say, the other colonizers don't usually claim to have some sort of historical or religious claim to the land. And then, of course, there's the question of the fact that Jewish persecution, the persecution of Jews, racism directed at Jews, has been a reality in Europe and still is. And that has certainly strategic implications. I don't think it makes the ideology particularly different. But the strategic allegation, changes that it makes is that those of us who believe that Zionism is a tragic mistake need to make the case that Jews will be safe without Zionism. And I believe that that's a very easy case to make, but it's a case we need to make. And the reason I think it's a very easy case to make is, look, I have there's a chapter in the book which tries to make that case. It relies on the work of a Jewish historian called David Beale. And essentially what Beale is arguing in the book is that if you talk to Zionists particularly, you have this idea that Jews without a state were powerless, and Jews with a state could control their own destiny. And Beale shows that that's not true, because he shows, first of all, that there have been very many cases in history where Jews have exercised real power without having a state. But he also makes the very valid point that no Jewish state has ever survived for very long without a very powerful non-Jewish patron. And of course, we know now that the state of Israel's non-Jewish patron is the United States of America. So what kind of sovereignty is it where you can only, what kind of sovereignty is it where it can only survive if an imperial power says it can survive? I mean, if there was some sea change in American politics tomorrow, that would be the end of the Israeli state. So I think it's very easy to make that case. And the other point which makes that case is that there is no, by definition, if you have a functioning democracy, then Jews are protected. And it's no good arguing, well, they had a democracy in Weimar and Jews, and the Nazis came afterwards, because Weimar collapsed. Weimar was still there, then the Nazis would be an opposition party, and Jews would have been subjected to some imprisonments, but there wouldn't have been a genocide. So what, if you have a democratic society, Jews might be subject to the same sort of forms of bigotry and prejudice which exist in many democratic societies, but it's not legally sanctioned. It doesn't threaten Jewish safety. It doesn't threaten people's freedom to live their lives. And therefore, in my view, democracy is a much greater guarantee of Jewish safety than an ethnic state. But certainly the fact that it has these special features means that the criticism, if it's going to be effective, has to take that into account. What you're referring to is, I mentioned Boyarin earlier on, and it's his argument, which I buy. I think he's right. Boyarin wrote a book called Unheroic Conduct. And the reason he called the book Unheroic Conduct is that it relates to an incident in which Freud relates in one of his memoirs. And essentially, according to Freud, he was walking with his father in the streets of Vienna, and a couple of anti-Semitic bullies arrived and knocked his father's hat off. And Mr. Freud Sr. picked up his hat and grabbed Sigmund by the hand and scurried off and left the premises. And Freud says, I found that very unheroic conduct. So behind that is a very masculinist view, a very traditionally masculinist view of what a Jew is all about. And in fact, to stick with Boyarin for a moment, the subtitle of his book, the book is called Unheroic Conduct, the subtitle is called Heterosexuality and the Invention of the Jewish Male. And what he's arguing is that the idea of the Jewish male as a tough guy, a military figure, was very central to Zionism. I mean, the most famous exponent of this, or infamous, was a man called Max Nordau, who talked about Musseljuden, muscle Jews, that we need to stop having these kind of effete Jews who stay in study halls and pore over pages, and they need to be muscular Jews who, punch anti-Semitic bullies in the face, etc. And that's a very masculinist view of the world, because, where does it leave women? It doesn't. It talks specifically about male power, male dominance, male violence, in effect. And Boyarin makes the argument that he's not only arguing for the rights of women, but he's also arguing for the rights of men who do not want to dominate women and who do not want to be racist bullies. And it's very interesting to me, that, I mean, one of the many myths around the Israeli state, at one stage, they seem to have largely given it up, but it was, is this kind of bastion of feminist, feminism, etc., in which, because they once had a woman prime minister years ago, etc. But in fact, it's no more. It's no more feminist or no more pro-women than any other Western society, and in some cases less so. I mean, there's a very in the Israeli military there is a very ugly history of sexism, not only of sexism, not only of sexual harassment, of perennial sexual assault. There's a very strong, and remember, it's a hugely militarized society as well. So the militarism reinforces, this idea of the strong man who does bodybuilding, and by implication, the woman who, some women may be in politics, but their fundamental function is to make sure that the muscle Jews remain muscular. And I think it's very important to stress that, because, of course, one of the, to get back to Josie Adler's comment about modernity and tradition, etc., once again, it's this, we're fed this line about how it's this, it's this place of modernity, of respect for women, of respect for gay and lesbian and trans people, etc. And this hides a very ugly sexism, which is deeply ingrained in the society, which I guess, given its militarism, is not surprising. I have to put my cards on the table. I've had a sort of interesting intellectual journey, which is that, when I was a student many years ago, I used to go to seminars and thump the table and say, it's all about class, it's not about race. And I spent the last 20 years of my professional life saying, no, it's not really about class, it's about race. That's an exaggeration, okay. There is such a thing as economic inequality in the world, and dominant people tend to dominate economically, etc. But I really find unconvincing, the argument that this is fundamentally about capitalism and about economic domination. I'm sure they the people who advocate white supremacy, who advocate whiteness, who advocate Zionism and everything that goes with it would be horrified by economic equality. But I think you're dealing with something broader than that. Perhaps that's what I'm trying to say, to be more exact. So economic domination may be part of that, but the expectation or the belief that white people are inherently superior to others and therefore ought to exercise power over others, even if they don't physically colonize them, I think that's at the root of it. And I think that the economic domination aspect of it is certainly something we have to, take into account. But I think it's only part of a much bigger whole. The settlers are the front lines of the expansionist project, because you have to remember that Zionism is inherently expansionist. Okay, so what happens is that they have this 1948 UN resolution which divides the land. And it lasts all of 5 minutes because the Israeli state is not prepared to accept it, and it starts colonizing the land, which was taken away from, which was supposed to be Palestinian, etc. And of course, there's a famous letter which Ben Gurion, the first prime minister of the state, wrote to his son, in which he said, in effect, look, we tell them that we're satisfied with the United Nations resolutions. But that's just for show. We want as much land as we possibly can. And that has been fundamentally what it is about. And the settlers are the front line of that project. So it's very important to understand that settler violence, I mean, that doesn't minimize, it makes it even worse. Settler violence is not some sort of inchoate racism, which is, they see Palestinians, they hate them, etc. There's a very clear political objective behind settler violence, and that is to drive people off their land so that that land will become, it's a form of ethnic cleansing, if you like. More piecemeal than what we're seeing in Gaza at the moment. So, the settlers, you don't become a settler unless you are convinced that Palestinians must be driven off the land, and they see themselves as shock troops, and it's no accident that the two self-proclaimed fascists in the Israeli cabinet are both settlers, because that's the settler perspective, which doesn't mean it doesn't mean that the rest of the society is horrified by the thought of ethnic cleansing, but it's not something which they prioritize. It's not something which is central to their agenda. Perhaps the best thing I could do with that, I didn't deal with that in the book because I wasn't interested. In the book, I was interested in what the general argument told us about South African society today. And in effect, what it tells us about South African society today, and some of this will be familiar to people, but I think it puts it in a context, is, despite the fact that we've been a democracy for 30 years, the Whiteness Project, as Joe Bloom put it and as others have put it, is still very much alive in this country. The idea that, certain values are superior to other values. I mean, the whole thing was put perhaps best long before 1994 by one of this country's great thinkers, Rick Turner, who said in 1972, who wrote in 1972 that, and he was talking about white liberals, but he could have been talking about, dominant attitudes in this country, that they believe that Western civilization is inherently superior to all other forms of civilization, but that Black people with education and effort can become Western. And that is a very dominant view in the society today. It is also common in the society today to, when people draw attention to continuation of racial inequality, for those people to be branded as racists. It's very consistent with this pattern. And I do give examples in the book, but I think anybody who lives in South Africa today will be able to provide lots of their own examples in which anti-racism is labelled as racist. And of course, outside South Africa, I mean, you did ask me to refer to that. I mean, this is, this explains an awful lot of things which are going on in Europe and the US at the moment. The idea that the memory, the memory of slave owners must be kept. That if you don't want statues to slave owners, then you're an anti-white racist, etc. But now to look specifically at the South African Jewish angle, I think the best way to put this is to. I was asked to write something for the New Statesman the other day. On sort of being anti-racist in the anti-racist Jew in South Africa, etc. And the point I made there is that up until 1994, we had this very interesting situation where, for a variety of social and historical reasons, Jews were disproportionately represented in the anti-apartheid movements. But at the same time, were ostracized and demonized by the Jewish community, who was either because people, the mainstream Jewish community, either because people were comfortable with apartheid or because they didn't want to stoke anti-Semitism, or because of both. And then what happened after 1994 is very interesting, or around the 1990s, which is that the Jewish establishment realizes that the Jews that they've been demonizing are actually going to be part of the powerful group now, and are going to hold positions in government, etc. And they go assiduously courting Jill Marcus and Arthur Chaskelson and Ronnie Casrils and all sorts of other people. And the sort of honeymoon lasts a while, but then collapses over Palestine. Because as soon as the Jews who've been welcomed back into the fold rather opportunistically and cynically, because it's expedient to do so, start suggesting that Palestinians should also not be the victims of racism, then they are demonized, which is where we are today. So that, in a sense, what has happened is that the prejudice has just found a new target, and they're still demonizing Jews who think differently. They've just shifted their attention from Jews who were opposed to South African white racism to Jews who were opposed to Zionism. I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is because, South Africa's been more active with the ICJ case, etc. But the problem which those who might want to do that have is, once you start that game, you are going to be alienating an awful lot of people. South Africa may have been, the only country so far to have gone to the ICJ. But, if you look at the way United Nations votes have been panning out recently, culminating in this last one, where the pro-Israeli vote was 10, minus Liberia, who recanted the next day. Then if you're going to start demonizing countries who are, if you're going to start demonizing countries who are pro-Palestinian, you're going to have to do a lot of demonizing. And you've got to remember, and I'm simply talking hard political realities here, this is all happening in a context in which the Americans, and to some extent the Europeans, are terrified of Chinese influence in the global south, in Africa and Asia and Latin America. As I put it to some groups I sort of talk to on these strategic issues, if they are going to take that attitude, they might as well simply write Xi Jinping a letter saying, "You've won. We've abandoned the field to you, and we're not going to try and compete with you anymore." So I think they're obliged to put up with things which they would rather not put up with. And I think there's another aspect here, you see, which I think that you make a very good point, but I think that the Western attitude to South Africa is they're a bit confused about South Africa, because on the one hand, you have there are all sorts of traditions in the country, part of which express themselves in mainstream politics, which are not particularly sympathetic to the West. But the establishment in the country is still largely very comfortable with Western values and Western attitudes. And in fact, sorry to keep punting my books, but I read this book at the time of COVID, in which I argued that one of the reasons why we had so many fatalities during COVID is that we followed the Western model of dealing with COVID, which turned out to be an absolute disaster. Whereas if we'd been looking at countries like South Korea and some of the other countries on the continent, we probably would have saved a whole lot of lives. So the irritation at taking this stance is tempered by the fact that they rock up in Johannesburg and Cape Town, and there's enough Westernness there to blur the edges. Well, I think the short question is that they aren't. I think the short answer is that the attraction is waning quite substantially. Look, the point is, okay, a lot of the attraction was based on the old Jewish safety argument, which I deal with in the book, and particularly for generations who lived close to or during the Nazi genocide. Obviously, the argument that Jews needed somewhere to be safe was very compelling. Plus the fact that a lot of Jews in Western societies like to be Western and identify as Western, and share a lot of those prejudices. Just as one example, which I mentioned in the book, in France, the sort of anti-Palestinian prejudice and the general anti-Black, anti-Arab prejudice are so scrambled together. You know, and I mentioned this guy, Alan Finkielkraut, who is a sort of very prominent neoconservative in France, you know, who starts off attacking French Muslims for being pro-Palestinian and ends up saying, oh, well, they also destroy the education system and they make the streets dirty and all the old racial prejudices, which we are very familiar with. So there are all those factors, but the fact of the matter remains that any poll you conduct of Jews in Western countries shows that, you know, substantially rising levels of opposition or indifference to the Israeli state among younger people. And we've got to clarify that, okay, just what does that mean? Because, and the American case is a very good example. So right now among Jews under the age of 34, 25% now believe that Israel is an apartheid state. And that doesn't sound like a whole lot, although historically it is a whole lot. But what you really need to look at is not whether they think Israel is an apartheid state, but whether they think Israel matters. And the percentage who believe that Israel matters is becoming a very small minority. So the attitude has moved from support, age-wise, to, in the main, either opposition or indifference. I mean, obviously, there are still pro-Israeli young people, but they're increasingly becoming a minority. Okay, essentialism is basically the view that groups of people, ethnic groups of people, have an essence, okay? That there is such a thing, that there is one Jewish culture, there is one white culture, there is Black culture, or if you happen to be an old apartheid ideologue, there is, you know, Zulu culture, Xhosa culture, etc., etc. And that people, human beings, can therefore be reduced to their cultural origins. So if you are genuinely Jewish, you will have the following attitudes. If you are genuinely white, you will have the following attitudes. If you're Black, etc. You've got the point up to now, etc. And essentialism is obviously is a very, and that's why the book's called Good Jew, Bad Jew, is because there's a huge contradiction at the heart of essentialism. And the contradiction is this: the essentialists want everybody in a particular group to identify with a particular set of values. And if you don't identify with that set of values, then you're not part of the group. But everybody knows that human beings aren't like that, and they're also always going to be considerable numbers of people in the group who don't share, who don't buy into that. And what do you do about them? Well, you expel them from the group. You say they're bad Jews, or they're bad whatever, it's white, they're self-hating whites, or and now there's a chapter in the book, where I think this comes through very clearly. There's a chapter in the book on comparing South Africa, well, comparing Zionism and Hindutva, which is the reigning ideology among Hindu nationalists, among Hindu essentialists in India at the moment. And it really illustrates the point, because Hindutva is this incredibly essentializing ideology, which is a huge irony, because Hinduism was invented by the British. What I mean by that is that the British arrived and colonized India and discovered all these different belief systems and faith systems, etc. And it was just all too complicated for British bureaucrats. So they decided they were called Hindu, which was kind of which really means Indian, etc. And Ashish Nandi, who I quote in the book, makes the point that, you know, to describe yourself as a Hindu essentialist is saying, you know, I've gone back to my roots, and I'm a proud bearer of the label the British gave me. And, you know, I think essentialism is still very much part of Western thinking. I think it's very much part of white supremacist thinking. And the worry is, I mean, one of the points I make in the book, in the South African context, I mean, okay, I've talked about the application to, you know, to people being accused of playing the race card, etc. But I think the book has something very important to say about hatred of foreigners in this country, about xenophobia in this country. Because first of all, it's based on an absurd essentialism. An essentialism which assumes there's somebody called a South African, which quite clearly has particular characteristics, etc., and whose purity is being diluted by Zimbabweans or Mozambicans or Somalis or whatever people happen to be. Which, besides being nonsense, is deeply ironic because, who created these borders in the first place? They weren't created by Africans; they were created by European bureaucrats, for heaven's sake. So, every time somebody stands up and proudly denounces the Mozambicans or the Zimbabweans, they're essentially saying that, somebody born on the other side of the colonial border is somehow different to somebody born on this side. And of course, the other reason why the book is a critique of xenophobia is that I make the point that this, one of the many problems about Zionism is this, this ideology of the state, this idolizing of the state. If you've been murdered by Nazis or you've been discriminated against, somehow you have a state and you live happily ever after, which is obviously untrue. But so much of this, anti-foreigner sentiment we see in this country is based on the idea that somehow being part of the South African state makes you a superior human being to somebody who's part of the Zimbabwean or the Mozambican state. Well, what I wanted to add to that is, I don't know how seriously to do it, but there's something there's a little bit of a cottage industry over the last few years, which seems to have died down a bit, which you no doubt are right. And that is of ex-South Africans or South African emigres who are now enthusiastic Zionists, who try to demonize Palestinians by comparing them unfavorably to Black South Africans. Okay. So now the Palestinians don't deserve rights because they don't have a Mandela and they don't have an ANC, etc., etc., etc. And this is hugely ironic because almost to a person, in fact, to a person, I know these people, they all thought that the ANC was a dangerous communist revolutionary movement. And at the time, they said all the things about the ANC that they say about Palestinians now. So you have this bizarre situation of people who were kind of, militant Cold War, anti-ANC people because they thought it was all controlled by communists and so on, suddenly now presenting the ANC as this kind of icon of civilization and humanity compared to these, barbaric Palestinians who commit war crimes, etc. Really, it depends on how important you think these people are, but I always wonder whether it's worth the effort of, digging out some of the things they said 30 or 40 years ago when they were here and playing it back to them and comparing it to what they say now. No, that's entirely true. That's what the point I was making. People were really put beyond, they were kept very much at arm's length. The communal establishment would miss no opportunity to apologize for them if it was right. And that's what made what happened in the 1990s so opportunistic and so cynical, because when it had suited them, they demonized these people, and suddenly they started hugging the people that they demonized. And it didn't take rocket science to realize that they were being entirely opportunistic. But yeah, there's no doubt that the communal establishment treated anti-apartheid Jews as they now treat anti-Zionist Jews. What you're saying accords entirely with my own preferences, but I don't want to impose my own preferences on other people. In fact, the New Statesman article that I mentioned argues, but it's my perspective, that we're now involved in a struggle to insist on being Jewish, to reject the notion that being Jewish means that you have to be Zionist. That's my preference. I mean, I can't tell people, you know, if people are born Jewish and indifferent to being Jewish, they're entitled to feel that way. I don't think I would suggest for a moment that people who just don't feel particularly attracted to being Jewish must pretend to be enthusiastic in order to give the Zionists a hard time. What I would say, however, is that I very much reject the notion, and that's how I live my own life. I very much reject the notion that Zionism is embedded either in the Jewish religion or in Jewish culture or in Jewish ethnicity. Okay. I mean, one of the things I think we need to, those of us who take the Jewish religion seriously, I think one of our tasks over the next couple of decades is going to have to be to rescue that religion from Zionism. And I think the same goes for other forms of Jewishness. So if you are born Jewish and you turned off by being Jewish, that's your right. If you are turned off from being Jewish because you think you have to be a Zionist, then you don't. Then the good news is that you can be Jewish in whatever way you want to be, and you don't have to be a Zionist. I think that's an excellent question. Okay, and it's something I've been interested in a while. Now, if you look at, I mean, it is certainly true, and it's partly my answer to Leonard Shapiro. I mean, it's certainly true internationally. I think we have to remember that there is, you know, many Jewish communities, if you are part of the Jewish community, despite what I just said, we all know that there is tremendous pressure from Zionists to make everybody conform. And if you are not deeply invested in the issue, you know, not saying anything about it or not being overtly anti-Zionist is a logical choice, because you know you want to get on with your life. Basically, you don't. You know, I mean, it sounds trivial, but you know, I often say that you know we would have a lot more allies if people didn't mind being shouted at by their relatives on a Friday night. But it is, you know, it does sometimes take that form. So the point, you know, I'm not suggesting that you know Jewish communities are kind of huge masses of militant anti-Zionists, but I'm saying that most people, you know, by the evidence we have, you know, feel far more negatively or more indifferent to the Zionist project than we're led to believe. And there is an opportunity there. And the opportunity, the point that I keep on making is, you know, if you want to, you know, this is different to South Africa in an important way. And the important way is this, you know, under apartheid, under South African apartheid, convincing white South Africans that apartheid was a bad idea was never a great success for obvious reasons. I don't believe that trying to convince Jewish Israelis that Israeli apartheid is a bad idea is going to be tremendously effective. But if you bear in mind that Zionism is partly, you know, Zionist state is partly propped up by, you know, supposed Jewish consensuses around the world. And if you consider that those Jews are not invested in the state in the same way as white South Africans were invested in the state, then I think there's a huge opportunity. And I think the start of that opportunity is to tackle the safety issue that I've been going on about. Because I do think that it is something which worries people. And I think that given what has happened to Jews over the centuries, I think the worry is legitimate. But I think that there's a counter to it. And I think we need to start making that point. I think really what I'm coming down to, what the book suggests, is that we really need, and this sounds trite, but I think I have a different take on it to a lot of people. I mean, you know, it's really an argument, as is a lot of the other things I write, for a real decolonization project in this country. I really think we do need to decolonize our thinking and our attitudes in all sorts of ways, away from essentialism, away from you know, this worship of the colonial state and so on. However, I think we need to do that in a non-essentialist way. And essentially my argument on decolonization is that we should not exchange one form of essentialism for another. So in other words, the dominant view in this country at the moment is West is best, and that needs to be challenged, and that needs to be replaced by a more African perspective. However, to go as some people do, and to say, well, we only want authentic African culture, and anyway, I mean, that is an invitation to another form of essentialism, which is going to be as dangerous as what we have at the moment. Because no culture is a monolith, all cultures are diverse, all cultures are plural, and the person who stands up and says, I am the authentic Black person, is saying that a lot of other people are inauthentic Black people, and that obviously has all sorts of perils of its own. I think we need to understand, and it is relevant to the Zionism theme, I think we need to understand colonialism and colonization as two things, essentially, imposition and exclusion, okay? You impose a particular view, and then you exclude anybody who does not identify that view. And the antidote to that is equality and inclusion. So the antidote to that is not to set up some straw person of something called Black culture, which 2 or 3 people. The alternative to that is to be open to a range of views, and to accept that not only are all cultures plural, but all cultures are influenced by other cultures. And the claim that there's such a thing on the planet as a culture who's not influenced by other cultures is ridiculous. And in the Jewish context, just because it's one of my favorite examples, one of the examples I mentioned is that, the people who consider themselves the most authentic Jews on the planet today, not the Zionists, etc., are people who dress up like 16th century Polish Christians who thought that they were imitating Persians, okay? That black hat you see, etc., was actually what the Polish middle class used to wear because they thought it was very trendy to be Persians, and somebody told them that's the way Persians do. So that really illustrates my non-essentialism in a very basic way, that people who claim to be authentic bearers of a culture need to be aware of how influenced they are by other cultures. I mean, there are organizations who exist to challenge this, to challenge the dominant thinking, because this has always been a not really democratic community and a not really pluralist community. They tend to be marginalized, etc. I think that just 2 points strike me as relevant here, and the one is. And I'm not criticizing anything. I'm simply making a point. I'm not saying people who don't do what I'm suggesting. The first one is that I think there needs to be thought given, if it hasn't been given to it already, to how even if it's it's a couple of hundred people or whatever the case may be, about how you turn that into a movement. Because when I think back on, I talked about various forms of Jewish life. I mean, one form of Jewish life, which I know quite a bit about, was something called Bundism. And Bundism was sort of basically Jewish labor socialism. You had a Jewish workers' club in Doornfontein, etc. And these were left-wing Jews of a particular description. But the reason I mention that is that Bundism was far more than just a political ideology. I mean, they had the Jewish Workers' Club, they had Yiddish theater, they ran a nursery school in Orange Grove for many years, etc. I'm not suggesting you should run a nursery school. I'm simply suggesting that, if you have a few hundred people who share the world in the same way, there's an interesting conversation about how you build that into a movement, and even if it's a small movement, it can be an important movement. The other thing, which you probably do anyway, but it's worth mentioning, because I used to do stuff like this myself. I think there's always a danger, and I'm being partially self-critical about this, of realizing that even if it's a Jewish initiative, it can't just be a Jewish initiative. In other words, it can be an initiative for Jews or people comfortable in something which includes, which is for Jews. But it has to engage beyond that. It has to engage with the white, it has to engage with the rest of the Palestine solidarity movement, which doesn't mean you have to agree with everything people say or do, but it means there has to be a dialogue, there has to be an arrangement, and and that people have to play a role in the wider fight for Palestinian rights and Palestinian dignity. I think some of us made the mistake in the past of thinking that if you made it for Jews only, it coincided with certain readings of Black consciousness ideology, etc. But I think it cut people off from influences and possibilities which were a mistake, and I hope that mistake won't be repeated. It does, and look, there is, from 1994, there has been an attempt by the Jewish establishment in this country to, in my way, obviously, a purely a fundamentally illegitimate way, to link the two issues. So, in other words, for particular reasons, which I don't have to go in now, I spent part of the early 1990s trying to convince the Jewish establishment that they wouldn't get eaten alive by a majority government. And one of the arguments that you repeatedly were confronted with was, well, they might not, discriminate against Jews, but what do they think of Israel? And the implication was always that they could be as nice as possible to Jews, but if they weren't nice to Israel, Jews would flee. And I don't think it's ever had any influence at all. I really don't. I think if Jews choose to leave here, I have never, I don't claim to have done a study, but, I'm involved in a Jewish congregation. I talk to Jewish people all the time. I've never heard of any Jewish person leaving this country because of its attitude to Zionism, quite frankly. It's not something. So I don't think it would make terribly much difference. Those people who don't, I think whether Jews stay in this country and contribute or leave depends on the same sort of attitudes which define the way other white people do. I don't think that, the current attempts to insist that somehow Jews, we had this ridiculous thing from the board of deputies claiming that they were going to be pogroms. I don't think anybody's buying that nonsense, quite frankly. So there's all sorts of problems about the way in which the Jewish community approach the world, but I think people deciding that they need to flee because the government won a case at the ICJ, I don't think it's a particularly serious problem. Well, I can only talk from personal experience. There are always possibilities. Simply, and maybe I'm talking to the wrong people, etc. I tend to find, for a variety of reasons, that Black people in this country who identify as Jewish tend in the main to be quite heavily Zionist. I haven't done any research. I can't explain this, etc. But certainly, my experience has been that is the case. However, I obviously am to a certain extent talking to the wrong people, because I went, to Johannesburg SAJFP meeting in which there were several Black people there who clearly identified as Jewish and didn't identify as Zionist. I think it's a question. I'm not dodging it, but I think it would be more important to ask the Black people who do identify as both Jewish and anti-Zionist what they think that should be done. And I don't think it's a cop-out to say I would tend to be guided by their assessment of what is needed. The last bit is his replacement by somebody else. No, Biden is not going. Look, actually, I'm exaggerating. The only thing which would stop Biden's support for genocide is huge political pressure within the US. If you had, for example, there have been demonstrations, etc. But if you had, for example, the kind of pressure in, the kind of reaction in the US to what's happening in Gaza that you had to the Vietnam War, that might force him to capitulate, etc. But what lies behind it? Well, many of the themes in the book lie behind it. As far as Biden is concerned, white Westerners are the center of the universe, and the Israelis are part of his white Western universe. And Palestinians aren't. Incidentally, one thing which we haven't mentioned throughout this discussion, which is relevant to Zubair's question, is that, I do discuss, which is very important and very relevant to events at the moment, Mahmoud Mamdani, whose book inspired my book, draws this distinction between civilized wars and colonial wars. And basically, Mamdani's argument is that in the minds of white Western Europeans, if white people fight each other, then the laws of war apply, the Geneva Conventions apply. If white people are fighting people in the colonies, only the law of nature applies, which basically is might is right. And that's the way not only Biden, but the US mainstream sees this at the moment. So you have this, you have this kind of outcry about, what was done to Jewish Israelis, which is, every Jewish Israelis have rights the same as everybody else, but then none of that outcry affects Palestinians. You can literally, what happened on October the 7th is an outrage because it happened to people who are part of the Western camp, and everything that's happened since is not an outrage because it happened to the outside. And I think that, despite all the flim-flam, that is Biden's view, it's Blinken's view, it's his president's view. And unfortunately, in terms of immediate prospects for change, it's the dominant view in the American political class. So I think the only thing that's going to shift this is over time a really strong citizens movement in the US, and I don't think that's out of the question at all. It's an important question. I'm not sure I know the answer, and I'll tell you why I'm not sure I know the answer. It's that on the surface, it is very important in the sense that, one of the myths about American Jews, for example, is this idea that, American Jews vote on the basis of politicians' attitudes to the Israeli state, which they don't do. I mean, there's been very robust survey research which has shown that they don't do. But Christian Zionists do. So you've got a mobilized group, highly ideological, with strong influence in the Republican Party, who are able to call the shots to a certain extent. The reason I'm slightly ambivalent is that I'm not sure whether it matters, whether you're a Christian white supremacist or an unchristian white supremacist. I mean, by that person who isn't Jewish, but who doesn't follow the Christian religion. So, in other words, the point I'm trying to make is that mobilized Christian Zionism is clearly a factor, but, isn't it just another form of whiteness, just another form of white supremacy? And if they weren't mobilized around the Christian banner, they'd be mobilized around protecting white civilization or Western civilization or something like that. But certainly you can't ignore the kind of political clout that they have. It's a very standard, they've been trotting this thing out for years. It's a knee-jerk thing. And for those people on the call, on the meeting who are not Jewish and are not familiar with this blood libel, basically there was part of European anti-Semitism is that Christians would accuse Jews of killing babies in order to use their blood for ritual purposes, which is one of the lies which were made up about Jews in order to demonize them, etc. So whenever the Israeli state is accused of violence, which of course is always, they say it's a blood libel because you're accusing us of killing non-Jews in order, some purpose or other. But of course, it's very much it's what the book is about. It's using. I mean, blood libels were indeed libel, racist libels, which cost people's lives. But what you do is you take a genuine racist phenomenon and you turn it into an excuse for racism, so that you don't have to. And if you take it to its logical conclusion, which they do, then you can never accuse the Israeli state of anything, because if you do, you're committing a blood libel. So it becomes a demand, which is really part of what the Israeli state is about. It becomes a demand for total impunity. Because if you criticize us, you're an anti-Semite, or if you criticize us, you're perpetuating blood libel. And yeah, the question about this stuff is not any surprise that the Israeli state does it. But the fact that it gets purchase in the West is I think, the really alarming part. The problem is I had a dilemma about the book. And the dilemma is this, that Avi Shleim, who I have a great deal of respect for, who's the emeritus professor of Oxford, of history at Oxford, who was an Israeli citizen, I don't know if he is anymore. Avi argues correctly that the term anti-Semitism is not the correct term, because, as you correctly point out, Arabs are Semites as well. That what we're actually talking about is anti-Jewish racism, which is I think, the correct term. The problem I had is that, if I kept on talking about anti-Jewish racism rather than anti-Semitism, nobody would know what I was talking about, because it's become so ingrained in the way in which, even among both racists and anti-racists, the inaccurate term anti-Semitism has become the term for anti-Jewish racism. And I do point that out in the book, but I simply decided that it didn't make much sense to continually use a term which people wouldn't relate to. If you look at the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, a Holocaust is a voluntary sacrifice. The claim that what was happening under the Nazis was a voluntary sacrifice is a slander which actually comes from Zionists, which blames the Jewish victims of Nazi racism for the fact that they were killed and persecuted. And I can't think of anything more offensive and obscene as blaming people who were the subject of the most appalling racist power for the fact that they were persecuted and victimized. So I prefer to call it what it was. It was the Nazi genocide.